Hello and welcome to week 4 of Signs and Symbols Enhancing Science Instruction Through Literacy in the MCCS Era. Right now we are on part 1 of week 4, which is a brief overview of the information processing theory, and this is meant to complement the readings and the other videos that you are watching for this week. So one of the first things to know is that information processing isn't one single theory. It is a family of theories that all share some common features. We are going to focus in on just one sub-theory or theory of information processing, but all of the information processing theories focus on the same thing. And this focuses on how learners perceive, attend to, and then process the information that they take in. One overall message of information processing is that there are certain things that need to occur for us to actually take in or learn information, and these are elaboration, meaningfulness, and organization. So I love the example in this peanut strip of meaningfulness. So if you haven't had a chance to look, you can take a moment and read through the comic strip. If we think about the mnemonic devices or memory tricks that work for us, all of them will fundamentally rely on one of these three things: elaboration, meaningfulness, or organization, as you can see from this example. Some things that we may think about to help us accomplish these three goals are things like graphic organizers, mnemonic devices, note-taking, diagramming, practice problems, concept maps, collaborative or group discussion protocols, transforming content, so things like making a song, drawing, writing a story, looking for and articulating patterns, categorizing, or engaging prior experience or prior knowledge, which is also very important, as we know. So anything that we can do to make something meaningful, to help us understand how things are related or organize, and elaboration. So not just memorizing content, but also going beyond just the memorization and elaborating or explaining in more detail, making some inferences, things like that. One of the most common of the information processing theories that I mentioned that we talk about today uses what is called the two-store or dual memory model. So we can start on the far left with the sensory input. This input is everything in the world around us that can be experienced through any of our senses. Think for a moment about the sheer volume of information around you right now. The feeling of your seat, your desk, your clothes against your skin, the sound of your neighbor breathing or fidgeting in their chair if you're working with someone else, the sights on the screen, everything else in the room, maybe if you're working at home, the smell of your laundry detergent. There is a lot out there that we could be taking in at any time. So all of that input comes through our sensory register or our sensory memory. Most of what our senses take in at any given moment is lost. Only the things that we actively pay attention to can move from the sensory register. Before I said something a minute ago about the noises your neighbor is making. So how many of you were actually noticing them, or the smell of whatever your surroundings are, maybe the laundry detergent or the feel of your seat? When I said it, though, you may have started paying attention to it. This allowed it to move on to your working memory, and that means that you were actively processing it. So it is important to be aware of the individual differences of our students. Some of them will be particularly attentive to specific types of stimuli. So for example, I know that Chris is very sensitive to smells. They can be very distracting to her, and sometimes she will lose the ability to attend to what she's seeing or hearing when there is a strong smell that's bothering her in the area. So just thinking about sensitivity to different sensory inputs in our students can be helpful. So anything that we take in through our senses that we don't pay attention to is lost. Um, so keep in mind, too, that your working memory is very limited. Different theorists have different feelings about how to define these limits, but a good rule of thumb is the idea that you can hold about 7 plus or minus 2 things in your working memory at any given time. So the idea is about 5 to 9. Now, notice that I say things, and this is important as we think about differences in working memory capacity, or what constitutes a thing or a chunk that we can hold in our working memory. In order to move from the working memory to the long-term memory, you need processing and encoding to occur. And this processing and encoding is the elaboration, the meaningfulness, and the organization that we just talked about. These three things allow us to make a connection between the information in our working memory and existing information in our long-term memory. This connection is what allows us to call up and use the information at a later time. So again, we're taking in new input or information through our sensory register into our working memory. At the same time, we're recalling from long-term memory things that are relevant to the information that we're taking in, and all of this is coming together and being processed in our working memory. Now, anything that we don't process and encode is lost and does not get stored in our long-term memory. So again, notice that the arrow between working memory and long-term memory goes both directions. This represents the way that we bring information out of our long-term memory to help with processing and encoding. Anything you are currently thinking about is in your working memory. So remember when I said that you could hold a certain number of things in your working memory? Let's talk about what those are. For a young child, learning to read each letter in a word is a thing. They have to actively think about what sound they make individually and what sound they make together. When I look at a word, I am able to recognize the entire word at once without separating the letters into individual things. This is a process called chunking. Once we process and encode material, we often store it in chunks. We rely a lot on this in science. Once we have learned them, we don't need to know about each of the individual base pairs and molecules that make up DNA. We think of the molecule as a whole. Same things for the water cycle or the different properties of an element. The list goes on, and I'm sure that you can come up with some specific examples from your field that you teach in. So, the central executive, as you can see up here to the top of the graphic, is what we use to control this whole process of taking in information and actively working to process and encode it and store it in long-term memory. So the central executive determines what we will attend to and what we will process and encode. It also determines how we will process and encode things. Baddeley, in a 1986 paper, uses the metaphor of a company boss to describe the way in which the central executive operates. The company boss makes decisions about which issues deserve attention and which should be ignored. The boss also selects strategies for dealing with problems. But like any person in the company, the boss can only do a limited number of things at the same time. The boss of a company will collect information from a number of different sources. And so when we think about what the central executive is doing in terms of information processing, this metaphor of the company boss can be helpful to think about how the control of information works in this system according to this theory. So the central executive is a very important part of this that we will rely on later as we talk more about things like metacognition, which will be our next topic, which relates to this idea also of goal-directed behavior. So this has been a brief overview of some big ideas related to information processing and also the two-store or dual memory model. Thank you.